Okay, with any luck, this will be our last video, right, on the sensors, the somatosensory. So, again, just all we're doing here in this part of the chapter towards the end is talking about the pathways connecting the sensory structures to the brain itself and areas of the brain that we've studied in chapter 13. So, when we were with vision, we left off at the optic nerve. And so the color coding is really just looking at, where these the sensory information goes. And it does cross, that's why that's an optic chiasm. And it turns out that the medial parts here are crossing and over to the other side, where the lateral is staying on the same side. So, and this helps us process three-dimensional images. So we left off with that optic disc where the optic nerve was leaving. The two optic nerves connect at an optic chiasm. Here, axons again from the medial part cross and project to the opposite side of the brain, and axons from the lateral to the same side. The optic tract connects to the thalamus, which projects to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe, and the superior colliculus that's responsible for visual reflexes, and hypothalamus for the idea of circadian rhythm. So we're sending this information to a variety of places to try to process and make meaning out of this, right? So in cortical processing, here we are, we're actually looking at the true somatosensory, your general senses, in the parietal. So we call this, again, the post-central gyrus, or these bumps of the gyra. This is, of course, the gray matter. And it turns out that we talk about this thing called the sensory homunculus, and that's just this name for this creature here, right? And it turns out it's medial to lateral from lower to upper body. All right, so lower body moving to the upper body. More sensitive areas are mapped to larger areas of the cortex. All right, so you'll see that the face has got some pretty large areas devoted to it, and hand is exclusively found here in this part. So this is part of the mapping. So when those sensations, again, the somatosensory sensations, touch, itch, temperature, pain, and so forth, are ascending, and they come up to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends them on to the cortex. This is a map of all the variety of places. If I've gotten a sensation from the eye coming here, a sensation from the elbow coming here. Now, I'm not going to put a picture like this on a test and ask you to label these parts. This is just very, very useful for us when we're trying, if we go into neuroscience, obviously. But not necessarily something that you are going to retain in an A&P 1 course. All right? So, the visual cortex, I say not only do we have the crossing of the medial fields, the inferior field falls on the superior retina, and the superior field on the inferior retina. This is maintained in the cortex with the superior region of the cortex processing the inferior. So we're flipping things again. Visual information is actually inverted and reversed, right? But your brain actually sets it back to the expected again. So this is just walking through. Again, I'm not going to ask this question on the test either. This again is just to help you understand or appreciate the complexity of these neural pathways and mapping. All right, so again, that's pretty much all we're going to cover on the sensory. So to the motor responses, so again, going back out to the body and doing something about that sensation and that perception. So starting in the cortex and moving down through upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, and these would be the descending pathway through the spinal cord. So you've been sending all this information to the cortices, which have progressed to some of the association areas that have told you about this information, helped you to kind of qualify it and integrate it to understand it, right? And now you can remember as well as respond. So now you have an idea of what just happened, when did it happen for, what were the circumstances, and what do you need to do about it, is what we're saying here. So a lot of the motor response comes from the frontal lobe, and there's several distinct regions in the frontal lobe, right? So here's the areas we really talk about. So the prefrontal, I've mentioned this, is a goal-directed behaviors, right? So it's our motivation, our inspiration, all right? It's also a place where we think about consequences. So again, that executive, it's over everything else. It's trying to manage what is this response going to mean, all right? And then we have to, right, plan and coordinate the movement. So the premotor is really there for, right, trying to figure out how we're going to move, right? And because remember, you're a complex machine and many parts are moving at once, so we're talking about posture during the movement and balance during the movement. Well, that's the premotor area. There's supplemental motor areas, medial and superior, does the planning coordination as well, as it helps us with learned movements, right? And again, these aren't really shown very well on your brain models, so I'm not expecting you to identify those in lab. There's a frontal eye field, and this is generally shown on the models, and it moves the eyes with stimula. It is connected to the superior colliculi. There's Broca's area that we have on the models, and we talked about, and this controls our structures for speech production, lips, tongue, right, and some of the other various muscles. And then lastly, we have this primary motor cortex. All right, so this is what actually initiates the movement. This is where it would come from. So all of this was really being done to figure out, you know, what should I do about that? What does that mean for me? How do I do that? Right, and then, right, now I'm going to do it. So it is absolutely, it's very, I shouldn't say absolutely, it's very similar to what we find in the parietal. This is a frontal lobe we're looking at here. It's very similar in organization to what we find in the parietal lobe that we call the somatosensory, or primary somatosensory. But it is a precentral gyrus, so in front of that sulcus, that central sulcus, right? So now we can move. And again, that organization looks very much like the homunculus, right, when we were back here with when we're going to move, if we're going to move the trunk, but this would now be the frontal lobe, right? So upper motor neurons synapse with motor neurons in the brainstem. So upper motor neurons up here, right, in the precentral gyrus, part of the frontal lobe, and move down to the brainstem. There's midbrain medulla. So join there, and we call these the cortico-bulbar tracts. And then the spinal cord are the cortical spinal tracts. Again, we said they're named for where they start and where they end, and because the start is a cortex, we know these would be descending tracts. All right? The neuron cell bodies are either in the ventral horn or the cranial motor nuclei. All right? So we have a very distinct organization. We looked at the ventral horn and the spinal cord. All right? And as for the cranial motor nuclei, we didn't point them out specifically. They're scattered, right? And these will affect skeletal muscle, right? So we also are going to send some of this information to the cerebellum through the pons, and so we're going to figure out somewhere in here between the midbrain, pons would sit here, and the medulla, we would be sending information over to the cerebellum, so the cerebellum could edit or compare what our planned movement is to the sensory information coming up, right? So then we see in this, you know, the anterior, lateral, right, corticospinal tracts, and again, these are the upper motor neurons coming down. And then from the spinal cord would be the lower motor neurons, because, yeah, they're going out to the body, all right? So here, the appendicular versus the axial control, it turns out that the lateral corticospinal tract, right, is responsible for appendicular muscles, right, and say the ventral horn in the lower cervical and lumbar spinal cord is larger, representing the greatest number of muscles controlled by these areas. Just to let you know, anything again in italics is just to let you know. The anterior corticospinal tract, and these are both represented by their positions. There's lateral, right, there's the anterior, would be right about here, okay? Controls muscles of the body's trunk, the axial, and so they synapse again with lower motor neurons located in the medial regions of the ventral horns. So again, this organization is imperative to function here in the central nervous system. Other descending axons, known as the extrapyramidal, so they're outside the corticospinal and form pyramids of the medulla. So remember, there's two large swellings on the medulla, and we call those the pyramids. So there's tectospinal, and again, that may not be so obvious that that's a descending tract, except for the fact that it ends in the spinal cord. So this is actually the midbrain to spinal cord, and controls posture. There's a reticulospinal, which is part of the reticular system to the spinal cord, influences the, again, limb movements, muscle tone, and even some autonomic function. And there's a vestibulospinal, so this is going to control balance, right, because that's what the vestibule was responsible for. So nuclei vestibular to spinal cord. All right. The ventral horn output is really only skeletal muscle, and so the lower motor neurons are in the ventral horn, and they have long axons up to a meter that reach out to their target. So when we're going out from the horn, so what we were talking about up until now has all been synapses of neurons coming down, descending, right, axons that are collectively called tracts. So once we're leaving from the ventral horn of the spinal cord, we're really going to innervate skeletal muscle all over the body, because remember that spinal cord goes up and down, right? So axons branch to maximize influence, and the motor units, right? Well, that's what we talked about with the motor units back in like chapter 10. And precise movements require, again, fewer fibers with the motor units, but that's again just to let you know that, and what I need you to know is that the ventral horn is really controlling skeletal muscle, and it's just going out to all these different muscles you studied on your second practical and your third test. All right, back to the reflexes. I said this is where we started. We simplified, right? Here's where we started. We simplified the situation. We can go back to the hot stove, the withdrawal, the stretch, the corneal, and so on as far as reflexes, and note the other pathways that now influence this. So again, this is not, you're not going to trace the pathways for me on a test. You should be aware of which ones are ascending and which ones are descending, and what areas of the brain are responsible for what. But this is really how, if you pursued neurology, you would have to understand where this entire pathway and trace it up and back. And it starts to get pretty complicated when we try to map it. We're just going to really focus on some general themes again. So if you have any questions, please ask me. Some of this might be confusing to you, especially, so as you process it in your cerebral cortex, think about anything and be sure and ask, will this be on the test? Did you really want us to know this? And could you re-explain that? Because it was, again, I know it was a little bit clunky at the end of this chapter. It's not the smoothest chapter. Most of them have been, but this chapter is a little bit clunky at the end. So please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be happy, more than happy, to discuss and go back over this stuff.